I think that it's almost a self-inflicted wound to some degree that the cybersecurity industry is kind of perpetuated on itself, where it's this shiny object syndrome. Instead of focusing on these fundamentals and the foundational things that can be done, the emphasis has always been on the next great shiny object, whether it be EDR, XDR, AI driven, whatever it might be. All great tools, all of which have some purpose and some place in a security stack somewhere, but not at the expense of ignoring some of these basics. If you have all these shiny objects and all these great tools in place, it's not really going to matter if you're leaving the front door wide open. And I think time and time again, we're seeing that is the case. And so as we want to point fingers at something that couldn't be avoided, it's just, it's making the problem even worse.
Welcome to the MSP Zone. I'm your host, Charles Weaver. Today, we talk about a topic that I like to call cyber attack or cyber negligence. That's the title of today's episode. And let me give you a preface of why we're talking about that. As cyber incidents continue to dominate headlines, a critical distinction is emerging where some organizations are truly legitimately victims of sophisticated cyber attacks, while others are compromised largely because of a failure to follow basic security precautions. This episode is designed to explore where that responsibility truly lies, where and how attackers exploit preventable gaps, and what MSPs must do in order to keep their clients, from moving from a reactive, I'll call it defensive posture, to a more proactive cyber hygienic posture. And today, helping me unpack a lot of this very important and potentially dense material is our old friend, Corey Munson. Corey Munson is Vice President of Sales and Marketing at PCmatic, where he has spent nearly 2 decades helping organizations and MSPs rethink endpoint security through proactive zero trust approaches. With over 20 years of experience in sales, product marketing, and competitive intelligence in the computer industry, he brings a business-focused perspective to cybersecurity risk and prevention. Prior to joining PCmatic, Corey held several sales and marketing roles at Gateway, where he was involved in product marketing and competitive intelligence initiatives. He holds a BA in political science from Iowa State University and is a frequent industry speaker on cybersecurity accountability, ransomware prevention, and the role of application allow listing in modern security strategies. Corey, welcome to the MSP Zone.
Charles, great to see you. Always great to talk.
Thank you very much for joining. I know you're very busy and always appreciate your take on things. This actual topic came from, I think, something that you had posted out on LinkedIn. And for those of you who are not following Corey on LinkedIn, you should probably go there, because I get a lot of my ideas from things that you post as, wow, this is a really interesting take and nobody really has ever thought of this. And that's why I thought the same about this topic. But let me ask you a threshold question. Is it fair to begin talking about distinguishing between a legitimate cyber attack and something that is a preventable cyber attack? Just the threshold issue.
Yeah, let me set the stage as I'm coming at this not from a technical standpoint, because I am not the technical guy, but I come at it from a standpoint of being an observer who talks to a lot of MSPs, other vendors, law enforcement, cybersecurity insurance providers, you name it. So I've got my ear to the ground on a lot of this stuff. And I think pretty consistently the message from a lot of these folks has been a discussion around what is preventable. In the age of AI, is that becoming more the case or less the case that something might be preventable? But I think universally in these conversations, I hear more and more that as breaches, as attacks are being discussed, people are far too quick to label them as sophisticated. There are always going to be edge cases. There are nation state actors out there doing bad things, no doubt about it. But for the most part, and you've even got organizations like CISO that'll step up and say it's 90% of this stuff can be prevented. And a lot of it can be prevented by basic cyber hygiene that's being overlooked. And that seems to be the consistent message that runs through these conversations I'm having. So maybe I deviated way too far from your initial question or guidance there, but that's kind of where I'm coming from. And a lot of the stuff I've been posting about on LinkedIn is, are there examples day after day of that being the case, where something was preventable, or even where something's being labeled as sophisticated before you truly understand whether it was preventable?
I mean, if this was 10 years ago, right, go back to 2016, a very different time, not that long ago, but I think that would have been a very different discussion you and I would be having about what is sophisticated. Like everything then would have been sophisticated. But I think that you bring up an interesting point. Can we still use that appropriately when you are having untrained kids? I don't know if they're young or old, but untrained bad cyber actors who are using tools, increasingly AI tools, to just kind of, spray their cyber malfeasance all over and see what sticks. I don't think that that's necessarily sophisticated at all. It's just they've got a tool that is more powerful than they would have had 10 years ago. And they're not particularly skilled at using it. They're just deploying it because they don't care. Your
I
take?
think it is. I mean, it's giving folks like that access on a wider scale to identify those who haven't taken basic preventative steps to lock their systems down. I think, I go back to conversations I have with, and maybe you had him on at one point, retired FBI Special Agent Scott Ogdenbaum, who travels the country along with a network of really good guys that kind of mirrored their career path along what Scott did. But Scott talks about the fact that he's been traveling the country over the past 15 years talking about the need for basic protections. And his presentation essentially hasn't changed in 15 plus years of doing so. And these things are still being overlooked. Breaches are still happening because of RDP being wide open, or passwords being exposed somewhere, or a phishing attack, getting somebody to click on something that shouldn't be. None of that's changing. I think AI and all that it brings with it is simply just accelerating maybe the exposure that's out there.
So picking up on your comment that these are not necessarily sophisticated attacks, let's stop overusing that term. Let's maybe just instinctively not use sophistication until we truly figure out what's actually being deployed, but maybe go to, was this preventable as a first description or conversation point when we already know, right? You talked about Scott Ogdenbaum, his presentation not changing in 15 years. That tells me that there's still something to learn and we still have easy ground, easy gaps to cover. So if we're talking about phishing, patching, RDP sessions, if we're talking about user access privileges and user access controls that could be easily turned on, monitored, and set in place, not costly things at all, right? I'm talking the fundamental blocking and tackling. Yeah, something tells me that we are still in rudimentary cyber hygiene mode. As unbelievable as that is in 2026, is that where we are?
I think so. I think to the degree that we can get our hands on post-mortem information about how attacks actually transpired and what is out there to publicly consume, I think time and time again, you see these attacks pointing back to these things. Now, again, there will be edge cases that have a degree of sophistication that are being perpetrated by a nation state actor. And that's a different conversation altogether. But I think when you're talking about small businesses, you're talking about school systems, you're talking about organizations that maybe don't have the resources to better protect themselves or even outsource that protection, they're being compromised by the lack of these basics being in place over and over again.
So there was a recent, there was a firewall vendor, out there that had a recent attack. There was I think somewhere in North Carolina, there was a breach not that long ago. And I think I'm trying to figure out if there's a balance. There has to be a balance between not piling on and saying, geez, what did you do wrong to cause it, right? So I don't think we want to create that type of accusatory posture initially. But I also think that there's got to be some amount of, was this preventable? Like what could we learn from this? And, if you're not going to change, right? That's the thing. We don't see any accountability or change behavior, at least that's talked about. So all we get is this, as you described it. It was a sophisticated cyber attack. Woe is the little guy who can't, they're not nation state resource rich and they can't defend against this. That is, I think, a very harmful posture to give people the idea that they can't do anything to take a part in their own survival, I think.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the case. And when you hear the boilerplate press conference, press release after the breach talking about the level of sophistication of the attack, it it offloads the blame or tries to point a finger at something that wasn't preventable. And whether that's being directed from legal counsel or wherever, I think that's a dangerous path to go down because it's ignoring the fact that something could have potentially been done. I think that it's almost a self-inflicted wound to some degree that the cybersecurity industry is kind of perpetuated on itself, where it's this shiny object syndrome. Instead of focusing on these fundamentals and the foundational things that can be done, the emphasis has always been on the next great shiny object, whether it be EDR, XDR, AI driven, whatever it might be. All great tools, all of which have some purpose and some place in a security stack somewhere, but not at the expense of ignoring some of these basics. If you have all these shiny objects and all these great tools in place, it's not really going to matter if you're leaving the front door wide open. And I think time and time again, we're seeing that is the case. And so as we want to point fingers at something that couldn't be avoided, it's just, it's making the problem even worse.
If we were in a studio, if this was MSP world and you and I were on stage and we had MSPs in the audience, we would certainly have a lot of them, standing up and shouting, we've been telling our customers for years about this but they won't do it, right? The client won't do it. I've heard that a lot. I know you've heard that a lot about just the basic fundamentals of things that could make things harder for the bad actors to get in. And yet the client says, I don't want to do it. I don't want to spend the money. It's a budget issue. I just don't believe you. Shouldn't you, as my MSP, just by virtue of you being there, shouldn't you deflect and prevent all these bad things from getting past? I think there's this myth of the MSP being this just gigantic figure capable of withstanding all these blows and shouldering all this risk, which is another educational moment that we need to take advantage of and attempt to fix. What do you think?
Well, and I think some of this, and you're going to know this better than me, is some MSPs are willing to accept compromise as they're engaging with their customers. Others that I've talked to are very stringent when they walk in the door. They say, here are my security offerings, and you need to take each and every one of these, and they include these fundamentals, and we're going to get things locked down and really minimize risk. Others are willing to say, hey, it's a la carte. You pick and choose what you want to do. Here's what I recommend. But if you don't want to do that, that's fine. How many MSPs are still operating that way versus those that are saying, I can't even accept you as a customer, if you're not willing to at least follow my guidance, which includes, we're going to address the phishing, we're going to address your OpenRDP, we're going to address the fact that you're allowing any application to run without any control whatsoever. I'd be curious, from your perspective, have you seen a shift in that? I know it's been a topic of discussion. I've talked to MSPs on either side. Hopefully it's tilted more towards those that want to be more stringent and rigid about who they're willing to take on.
Yeah, I think that the shift that I've seen over probably at least a decade now is the shift between previously the MSP would be valuable to the client by giving the client a multitude of options to pick from. Whereas today the MSP is saying, you don't get an option, you don't get to pull things back. If you're not doing it, you're going to get it from us or you're not going to work with us at all. That has been a major change. If I had to guess how many MSPs are actually taking that approach, I'd probably say it's still in the distinct minority. Like, I don't think that we're anything close to 50% of the global MSP community taking that type of a hardline stance. And I think that is probably the ones that aren't doing it that way are still in my clients don't care, right? And I think that's the danger zone for us, because that's the wide open opportunity for the bad actors, because they're saying, awesome, another day where a vast percentage of end user organizations don't care and they haven't convinced their MSP that they should step up and force the issue. That's just my take.
Yeah, I've been curious in how many MSPs are using the opportunity to lead with these fundamentals as a way to engage with prospects. Walking in the door with, there's any number of free scan tools and everything else that you can prospect with. But how many of these MSPs are starting with, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, I'm going to help you address these fundamentals. To some degree, they may not cost anything, but I'm going to send you down this direction because it's the right thing to do. Now, as we further the relationship and I gain more trust from you, let's have a bigger conversation about how we can take care of this on an ongoing basis, and we can help get things locked down. I've wondered if that's a lost opportunity to some degree, to be able to not only be out there as a thought leader within the community talking about foundational things and basics as an MSP, but also as you're out there prospecting for new customers, to offer it up as just something you're willing to do because it's the right thing to do and it furthers the relationship.
I think, I think, I think, Corey, that line of questioning and thought not only says a lot about the MSP's knowledge of the current state of affairs, but it's also a line of questioning that will tell the MSP quite a bit about their customer, right, or their prospect that they're talking to, and what their posture is. Are they aware of cybersecurity threats at all, right? Or are they of the opinion that, oh, it's never going to happen to me? What do I have that anyone would want to steal, right? That type of mentality. It'll tell them what they think about risk transfer, right? I'm happy to work with you because you're going to now take on 100% of my cyber risk. I would run away from that type of prospect all day long because they don't understand the reality of the world. But I think, to your point, it's an opportunity I wish more MSPs were taking advantage of.
Yeah, the appetite's there. I mean, I'm spending a lot of time in the community myself, just doing some cybersecurity awareness, digital literacy things within, my own local community. And there's a real appetite amongst these small micro businesses. They may not have the cash to bring you in as an MSP, but maybe there's, a chance that that's going to grow into a larger organization at some point if you're willing to get down on the ground floor by giving them some guidance as someone who's pretty well tuned into the cybersecurity landscape. Again, I wonder if it's a lost opportunity on some MSPs that are doing everything they can to generate more leads and prospect for more customers, but they're busy sending emails and dialing for dollars too.
I mean, I can only say that I think that if you're an MSP out there and you're solely or predominantly focused on the technical value that you bring, and you are ignoring, all right, Corey, you've been bringing up a lot of really good. I look at these as not just a theory or you know academic discussions. These are practical, everyday business discussions that, especially at the mid market and below level, there is nobody other than the MSP having that discussion with these organizations. And so if they're not going to get it from the MSP, if they're not going to get it from you, then they're going to get it from another MSP who's going to come along and displace you. And they're just going to say, why hasn't your existing MSP been talking to you about these things? Because they should be, and we should be doing things today to prepare you for what's coming tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the conversations I'm hearing out there are, there's no shortage of resources. There's no shortage of things to download and articles to read. If I'm a small business owner looking for some cybersecurity guidance and I know I can't bring it in internally and I can't outsource it, but what I'm missing is, how do I put any of these things into action and how do I prioritize? And again, this isn't new necessarily, but I still think these are conversations that aren't always. We work with our MSP partners every day, and one of the things we try to engage on is there a way for us to help you have better conversations within your community and help you prospect. And I can give you an example of one MSP that came to us saying, "Help us let's do a webinar. Let's do an educational type of webinar." And I said, "Great, sketch out an agenda for me of what you'd like to cover, and I'd be happy to support that. And you can invite whoever you want to invite." And I looked at the agenda that they put together, and it was dominated by technical speak. It was absolutely overwhelmingly technical. And so I doubled back and said, "All right, tell me more about this audience that you want to present to." And it was business owners, it was um, pastors at churches, people like that would
Really?
have no appreciation for probably most of what was going to be presented here. And we were able to reframe it and talk about, translating this into real speak about business continuity and you know things that are going to resonate much better with the people that were going to attend. Again, this seems like it seems logical, but unfortunately, I think it's still not happening. I think you have too many MSPs that are still leading with overly technical speak and diving in to talk about EDR and XDR and things like that. Whereas there's a real opportunity to translate it into real language that'll resonate better, and then getting to these foundational basic cyber hygiene pieces that could really help.
But Corey, all right. So that sounds completely plausible, especially at a certain segment of the market where they are just very comfortable leading with technical. Do you believe that it's because they don't understand the non-technical business cyber issues, or they're just uncomfortable in communication? Does that distinction make sense to you? And just hazard a guess.
I think it's communication, at least in terms of the feedback I get. I think there's a real acceptance of the fact that most of the folks within our community, the MSP community, are technical, and
Yeah.
communication and sales skills and those soft skills to translate that into something that the broader community can appreciate. I think they're quick to admit that's not their forte. Okay, great. How do you overcome that? Because again, it's potentially a lost opportunity. And I think this is all kind of interwoven and interconnected back into this idea that a lot of these things are preventable. And here we are talking about overly technical things when we're not even leading with the things that could, well, again, if we believe CISA, prevent 90% of this stuff potentially.
I agree with you, Corey. I think they understand technical. They grew up from a technical background. I think they do I think they're smarter than they realize about these issues of cyber risk, cyber prevention and hygiene. I just think that they suffer from a lack of confidence in being able to talk confidently about it. At least I hope sincerely that that's really at the root of it, because that's a fixable problem, right? We can
It is.
teach people to become better communicators.
And I think the fallback has been, all right, go sell on FUD, right? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. If you're struggling to communicate, find the scariest news stories, whatever it might be, put it in front of these folks and say, if you don't sign up with me and sign a contract here today, this is going to happen to you. I would challenge there's a fine line between FUD and being realistic and forthcoming about what the real risks are. And that's important to be able to communicate. There's also, I think, an opportunity to communicate if we get your security posture in line, Mr. and Mrs. Business Owner. Maybe you're eligible for tax incentives that are coming down from the state or federal level. Maybe you're better positioned to get a bigger discount on your cybersecurity insurance policy because you're going to be able to show that you're fully aligned with the NIST frameworks or CIS controls. Or maybe you happen to reside in a state where you can insulate yourself if something were to potentially happen from some liability, because the state allows that if you've got your security posture in place and it's pretty well documented, you have some insulation from liability. Having those kinds of conversation to me are really interesting versus always leading with the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I think some of that's
Agreed.
happening, but it's still probably not enough.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I want to talk about technology versus behavioral change. My opinion is, and I'd like your input on this, is that now compared to, let's say, 10 years ago, the technology from a mid-market and SMB standpoint is certainly more affordable and readily available. So it's not just affordable, but it's easier to use. It's easier to access and consume technologies that 10 years ago would have been still largely, in the purview of the enterprise, right? Because of cost, complexity to use, deploy, and all that stuff. If you agree with that assessment that the technology is now available down to even the smallest of businesses, then there's behavioral change, right? And you're a big, I think, proponent of zero trust, allow listing, kind of what I would call a behavioral change to how you run an organization. Can you speak to that as a general concept of, you know, have we democratized the technology to the point where we can just talk about behavioral change for cyber prevention?
For me, it breaks down into and I've been any part of any number of conversations about the value of cybersecurity awareness training and whether it still has value, because any number of studies will suggest to you it's not altogether effective. I go back to 5 or 6 years ago when the leader of a very, very large cybersecurity awareness training company once told me, if you consider the way AI is coming and how good it will be virtually impossible not to click on things. Well, we're fast approaching his prophecy there. With that being the case, does it mean we shouldn't be acknowledging that there's a behavioral element to this? I think you still have to. You're negligent if you're not trying to figure that part out. But I also think it's healthy to accept the fact that somebody will eventually click on something that they shouldn't be clicking on. And if that is happening, what do you have in place? Is there something in place to prevent the execution of whatever has been triggered by that click? Is there something in place to control whatever application might be attempting to do something that it shouldn't be doing? Still think that there's a balance there, and I'm not sure this is going exactly where you wanted it to go, but it's the way I've really been intrigued to see. There's even state and federal legislation increasingly around digital literacy and cybersecurity awareness and how that needs to happen even as young as kindergarten into the public schools as part of the curriculum. But there's also a need at the community level. I think all of that is absolutely still valid, but we need to understand, and the studies have showed pretty clearly, that's not going to prevent everything that could potentially happen. So I kind of see cybersecurity awareness and the behavioral component was one of these fundamentals. It's something that you better have locked down and you better have it in place, but it not at the expense of something that's going to be more preventative, kind of upstream from there.
Do you think, I know you're not necessarily in the cybersecurity awareness training business, but I've seen a lot of these, I'm sure you have too, where they're just like, this is why you don't click on this type of a link, right? This is why bad people sometimes send you links that can end up harming your computer and therefore your company. Good to know, largely more on the technical side, but I think that there's still a fundamental issue that I'm not sure is being addressed, and that is why would anyone care to harm my company? And why would anyone care to go through me, the company's controller or chief accountant or head of HR, or pick the role? Like, I think that there still may be a large number of people out there who think, why me? Why am I reasonably a target? Is that fair to say, or am I missing the mark?
I think so. I think that's an element of the awareness, digital literacy, digital citizenship conversation that needs to be had is, why would somebody who's potentially targeting my company be interested in what I'm posting on social media? Or why are they curious to see how many kids I have and what the names of my kids are? And the fact that I've got a yard sign in front of my house with a picture of my child with their name and their school. I'm not sure if folks fully have an appreciation for how that's all interconnected to how your organization might be targeted or how you might be seen as the inroad into targeting a particular organization. I'll go back to my friend Scott Eigenbaum. He talks about a need to shift your cybersecurity mindset. This is more a cultural shift in how you're approaching every day with a little bit of healthy skepticism about darn near everything. And I think that that's lacking. And that's an element beyond here's what you should be not clicking on, or you should be mindful of this kind of business email compromise in disguise. all those kind of logistical pieces, operational pieces that you've got to train for. But it's a bigger picture of, to your point, why me? Why am I important in this equation? And I'm not sure that's always communicated well.
Yeah. No, I think I sense that that's a problem that still exists, but for those entrepreneurial go-getter MSP types, that's a huge opportunity in my book.
Absolutely. I mean, how many of these surveys that come out almost on a monthly basis? And again, we're talking largely about small and medium-sized organizations, but for the most part, they still do not consider themselves to be a risk or a potential target. I mean, overwhelmingly, survey after survey, no matter how bad these stories are, how much news and attention are focused on these organizations, still don't think that they're at risk.
Yeah. I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier. I do believe and agree with you that the landscape, the public policy, the legislative, the thought leadership landscape is changing slowly, but absolutely surely in the direction of being more cyber hygienic, which gets us back to this notion of, I think that there is a definite sunset period for the ability to be legitimately called a cybersecurity victim in a majority of the cases, as you see states like Texas came out with their, I call it it's a safe harbor law basically, but basically it's a cyber immunity or managed services immunity. But basically, if you're following certain rules, if you're following certain accepted core frameworks, you're going to have certain legal protections. You're not going to be subject to punitive damages, right, in a civil litigation, et cetera. I think that is undeniably happening across the U.S. I think it's happening across the world. I think insurance, you mentioned insurance, they're taking a similar path, right, with their sphere of influence, ability to adjust premiums. Absolutely. So I think all of the elements are aligned in the same direction. That is going to drive, I have to think, drive a ton of opportunity to the MSPs to, if the MSPs are in the position to say, here's what we recommend. You don't get to choose and you don't get to modify what our recommendation is. We're the professional. This is what we're going to say. If you want to achieve and unlock all these benefits, that's got to be a good thing for the future.
I think so. And I think to a large degree, it's a more powerful conversation to have than everybody else that's walking in the door said, selling on fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's the interconnected, conversation back to these potential benefits. And, to go to the insurance piece, and I know you guys are doing some things on the insurance front. I think the interesting part there is I think we're reaching the point where these providers, not only on the front end during the underwriting process, are being more stringent, and it's no longer just answer 3 questions and we're going to give you a $500,000 policy. Obviously, the underwriting standards are different, but I think to see any type of payout on the back end, it's no longer just you're a victim. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take care of you. It's what was this preventable, and were you doing everything necessary to prevent this? Which you dive deep into that, and the legal implications and the court battles around those conversations are happening. But I think I think it's a change of the conversation, just from you were attacked, you were a victim, to were you doing your due diligence to prevent this from happening? And it's part of almost every class action lawsuit around a data breach that you come across. I mean, 2 days after the win was supposedly breached and their data was out there to be had, somebody was filing a class action suit talking about the fact that they weren't doing everything they could to protect their customers and their employees' data. So
that's a scary thought, right? And I've been in a couple of cases now, on the as an expert witness, not a party, but as an expert witness talking about this, best practices. But yeah, these things are being litigated, right? It's not just, it's either going to be in a litigation scenario or it's going to be in my cyber claim is being denied because, and then why was it denied, right? We have an MSP. We don't have an MSP. We thought that's because we had insurance, we're covered, right? This type of thing. Like, I think there's still this notion that they can do whatever they want to. And as long as they've got a cyber policy that's in effect and current, it's going to pay out. I think that's a hugely dangerous. It's changing, but I think that's what we're part of the problem that we're trying to correct. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? These cybersecurity insurance providers have been paying out millions and millions. They're not going to be as quick to pay it out anymore, and they're looking for reasons not to pay it out. I mean, that's the cold hard fact. And
Yeah.
if they can point back to something that you did or didn't do, they're going to take every opportunity to point that out.
So if we're establishing a well, let me play right because I think some people out there listening to this are going to say, great, so we are 100% responsible for every cyber attack that comes our way. I think there are legitimately crafty and very powerful mechanisms that could cause and lead to a breach or security or data incident. I don't want to lead anyone to think that there are just, nothing is preventable. I'm not saying that the right way, but there are sophisticated, to use your earlier language, there are certainly sophisticated bad actors out there doing some really bad things, using innocent parties, let's say, as conduits into, so third party vendor attacks really designed to get into the ultimate party, which is, someone else down the line in the supply chain. That being said, I think the vast majority, would you say, are defensible, defendable, and avoidable security incidents?
I sure think so. I go back to a conversation I had a couple of years ago with one of the lead security researchers as it was part of IBM's security team. And her exact quote to me was, where there will always be edge cases. And this is not, a de facto blanket statement, but she said, it's almost always a password. It's almost always a password. It's almost always a failure on some level of basic cyber hygiene. She said, will the AI tools and things like that accelerate the exposure of all of this and kind of be this force multiplier? Absolutely. But at least as we sit here, and admittedly, this was a few years back, her position was, man, it's always something that could have been prevented if you really look back at it. And if we had more visibility, and we don't for any number of reasons, right? If we had more visibility to kind of the postmortems on most of these attacks and most of these breaches, I think that's the story we would see underneath all of this. There's some people out there that are really advocating that a lot of that information become more public. There's arguments to be made about why it's not public, but I would suspect that we would see more and more of somebody clicked on something they shouldn't have, or passwords are being reused across X number of accounts, or the default password has been used for the past 15 years inside this organization, and it was there for the taking. I think it's still there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that you and I probably are unique given what we do. We see and have access to a lot more information than the general public does about the back end workings of cybersecurity and the MSP community at large. But I think there are some great examples. Is Wind public or private company? I think they're private, aren't they?
I think they're private.
I mean, I could see if you're a private organization, you have every reason to, keep a lot of this stuff protected. You probably have corporate counsel coming in at the very beginning of that, covering everything or nearly everything that is done in the postmortem, and having it covered by privilege. But that the township, or what I think it was a township in North Carolina, that beach community that just got hit, that's a public institution. I don't think that there's anything to be gained by keeping that secret. I mean, I think that the citizens who certainly pay taxes in that region have a right to know why it happened and what could have been done to prevent it. I think, sheriff's departments, public utilities, right? Anything that's in the public domain, I think, has some responsibility to show their cards and say, let's see what happened. And let's actually look at it, because, why not?
And I would tend to agree. I think you're going to get valid arguments that some of this stuff shouldn't be exposed, and it's only going to, enable some bad
Because it would lead to
actors
something else, another
even
attack.
further. And
Yeah.
my understanding is there any number of information sharing communities out there that do have access to some of this data and are able to share it behind closed doors, which is good. But I think, taking a look at an organization like CISA, and, they're going through their own issues now to see how important they're going to be going forward, or if even funded going forward. But if the message from them pretty consistently has been about 90% of this could have been prevented, they've got access to all that information. They know what's at the core of most of what's going on out there. And even to take a look at, and I believe they could collaborate with the FBI on this. I think it's Operation Winter Shield is something they've really been pushing of late. Again, it's all about fundamentals. It's all about basic cyber hygiene. They're going to have their bulletins talking about serious vulnerabilities and diving in deep on big, broad technical issues. But the thing they've really been pushing publicly recently is this idea of basic cyber hygiene. So again, it pivots back to, it all seems to trace back to that as the starting point. And that's where we should be focusing our attention. And, even the other thought I had when we were talking about labeling these things as sophisticated and the risk in doing that, I think there was even, I think I shared this on LinkedIn, there was a story of a city that was compromised through a business email compromise where it was $300,000, $400,000 or something was misappropriated and redirected because of this. And it was almost immediately labeled as a cyber attack. Okay, if you label it as a cyber attack right out of the gates as part of your press release and your press conference, are you insulating your employees and your staff from somebody who was negligent and the process wasn't in place to validate the vendor that we were wiring $250,000 to? So I think a lot of this, again, goes back to how we're labeling these things and how we're talking about these things publicly. And let's all get on the same page about what actual sophistication is, what an actual cyber attack is versus business email compromise. And maybe they do all fit under one big umbrella. But unfortunately, I think in some of these cases, too many of these cases, the language is used to kind of insulate folks from responsibility.
I think you're correct, but I think that the time is changing. I think that as more and more cyber insurance claims are denied, flat out rejected, and that story is going to get picked up, right? So especially if it's a township, a city, a municipality, right, and that's going to become part of the public record. Like, we had cyber insurance, how come it didn't pay out? Oh, it didn't pay out because we did something wrong, and so the cyber insurance company is claiming we were not. If they don't use the word negligent, then certainly they can come up with something else, which is they weren't following cyber best practice. Right? I think that the MSPs have an incredible opportunity to get out in front of this and start to engage in conversations that are going to result in at least a conversation, at least make the case of why they're presenting a modified cyber front in their managed services and why they no longer, the client, to say, I don't want that. I don't want EDR. I don't want antivirus. I don't want, endpoint protection, right? None of that. I think every day is a day closer towards differentiating between cyber crime and that sophisticated cyber crime versus you could have and you should have done something.
I think you're right. And I think conversations like this and conversations that our MSP friends can have across the community will all get us closer to that day.
Yeah. So I guess in closing, the question for the audience is, are you having these conversations with your customers, and are you talking to them about what you as an MSP can be doing for them and how the customer should be thinking about their own cyber defense and what responsibility do they have? Because I think that they have quite a bit. You've heard from Corey quite a lot about the misuse potentially of this word sophisticated. There are sophisticated attacks happening all the time, but there are many unsophisticated and clumsy attacks happening. And I think that to the extent that those are preventable and we can educate on that, well, that's our job and we'll continue doing that. So Corey, thank you for coming on the podcast again. And appreciate your insights as always.
Always a pleasure.
All right. Stay safe, guys. Until next time.